We are in Hebrews, the 6th chapter, and last week we finished in verse 13, so therefore we'll pick up in just a moment. Well, we finished in verse 12, so we'll pick up in verse 13 of Hebrews 6. And you'll recall that I've suggested that verse 11 of 5 through 20 of 6 is a parenthetical statement. It's a diversion, if you will, although it's supporting what the Hebrew writer is going on to say. And you'll remember that started by the Hebrew writer in verse 10 of 5 bringing up Melchizedek. And he goes on to say in verse 11 that there's much to say, but it's hard to explain to you because you are in need of hearing aids. No, not that kind of hard hearing. You are dull of hearing. Why did you look at Paul, Linda? But that's not the kind of dull of hearing. It is the exact analogy that is being used, right? He's using that to represent the fact that you are hard of heart. Things are not sinking in. And so he goes on to admonish them along those ways. And where we ended last week is an important part because he's summing up this thought before he finishes his parenthetical statement, verse 12. He says, so that you may not be sluggish, or the same word is used there at the beginning of the parenthetical statement, dull, hard of hearing. So you won't be sluggish, but imitators of those who through faith and patience inherit the promises. Now, he is going to introduce someone, and you know that just a few chapters later, he introduces a lot of people who are exact examples of who we are to be imitating. But now he's going to introduce a very important individual, that being Abraham. But remember that where we ended last week, he says all these things so that we, or they, would not be sluggish, but rather imitators of those who through faith and patience inherit the promises. Questions or comments before starting into 13? All right, would someone please read verses 13 through 20 for us, please?
God made promises to Abraham because he could swear by no greater. He swore by himself, saying, surely he blesses, I will bless thee and multiply, and I will multiply thee. And so after he had patiently endured, he obtained the promise. For men barely swear by the greater, and an oath for confirmation is to them an end of all strife, wherein God willing more abundantly to show unto the heirs of promise the immutability of his counsel, confirmed it by an oath, by that by two immutable things in which it was impossible for God to lie, we might have a strong consolation, who having fled for refuge to lay hold unto the hope set thereof, which hope we have an anchor of the soul, both surely and steadfast, and entered into that within the wet veil, whether the forerunner is for an entrance, even Jesus made a high priest forever after the order of Melchizedek.
Okay, so you see just on surface that before we entered into this parenthetical statement, we introduced the idea of Melchizedek. We went to admonish the people not to be dull of hearing, but rather, in short, diligent students. And now he's made a full circle and he comes right back to Melchizedek. So in chapter 7, then, we're going to be on the topic of Melchizedek. Now, remember, the purpose of the Hebrew letter is to encourage, to admonish these first century Christians who are at Jerusalem to hold fast to Jesus Christ and to keep a hold of Him regardless. And nothing else matters, especially as they see their nation, their culture, what was their religion for their entire lives up until grasping a hold of Christianity, about to crumble, about to fall, is that religion is now pulling at them to come back to it. He's saying, no, ignore everything you see and feel, all the challenges you're going through, and hold to Jesus because He's the answer, right? That's in short what he's saying to these Hebrew writers. So in doing that, from the very beginning, he's giving the Jewish Christians reasons. He's saying, listen, hold to Jesus because He's greater than who? Chapter 1. Angels. He's greater than who? Chapter 2. Moses. He's greater than who that we're currently on? Aaron, right? The high priest. And so He's greater than anything you know. And where He's going to go now is He's even greater. He's still on Aaron, but the implications of that is He's greater than the very foundation of everything else you know. Here's how He does that. For when God made a promise to Abraham, they are being called back in this world to Judaism. Now, Judaism, this is a kind of simple and yet tricky question. Judaism is about what? What's the premise of Judaism? Old Testament law. Yep. And we see, if we take the Ten Commandments, giving in what book and chapter of the Bible? For the first time. Exodus 20. Where do we see promises to Abraham starting? You can start with the book, right? Genesis, yeah. 22 is one example, right? I think they even started a little bit before there. Well before the law. Now here is what they grew up believing. To leave the law is to leave God. Now it's amazing to me, and I'll bring up another point that to me it speaks volumes of the value of the Bible. But it's amazing to me the complexity of the Hebrew writer's argument. He's really getting at the premise of their thought process. He's saying, you know what? God's greater than the law. You know how I know that? Don't you forget the father of your faith. I cracked up. Some of the kids from town, in fact, it was Wednesday night. Last Wednesday night, we had trouble with the broadcast, and we finally shut it down and said, let's go outside and sing. And on the way out, one of the kids is saying, let's sing Father Abraham. And we sing that song, right? Father Abraham had many sons, I am one of them. So that is not just a Hebrew or a Jewish sentiment, but it starts there, right? He was the father of their faith. He was before the law. Was he righteous? Yes. Did God consider him faithful? Yes. He's introducing an idea here that God is greater than the law. Go ahead.
I found the verse in Psalms 110 and 4 after the order of Melchizedek. Was he spoke of before Psalms then, like in Genesis, Exodus?
Yes. So he is in Genesis. He's in Genesis. Let me get back to you here. It will be somewhere written in my Bible. But yes, so, and we'll deal with that in just a few minutes. But he's contemporary of Abraham. So he's the same time as Abraham. For when God, verse 13, when God made a promise to Abraham, since he had no greater by whom he swore by himself. Now, remember that in verse 12 he said, so you're not sluggish, but rather imitators of those who through faith and patience inherit the promises. If Mike, someone owes you money, I won't mention her name. The first bill I have here is a $10 bill. Is it more than $10? Yeah, I am. But I've got money in my hand, so I'm allowed to be, right? It's not enough. Okay, so if it was $10, so you've got to be patient, right? She's not even here tonight to pay you.
She's good with me.
She's good with you. But you still have to be patient, right?
Patient is very long.
Now, if I owe you $10, I'll be back for this later. If I do you have to be patient for that any longer?
Not anymore. We're paid up.
Because you received it.
I did indeed.
Now, I got hands out now. Now, Mike no longer is in need of patience, is he? Now, if you go to the bank, now I doubt there was any official agreement between you. I doubt she even said, I really promise to pay you. She may have. But if you go to the bank and you get money and you tell them, I'm going to pay you later, what do you have to sign? What's it called? A loan? What's what you sign called? Contract. It is a contract. It's a particular kind of contract. A promissory note. Right? We recognize that. Promise, right? Promissory. I promise I'm going to pay that. That implies that you're not getting it right now, right? You're going to maybe get later. You're supposed to get later. Don't say maybe if you're trying to get the loan. Yeah, he's the guarantor, right? So here is my point. He's saying, have patience and faith. That in and of itself implies that you don't get the reward right now. So what he does is he introduces Abraham. Because Abraham was the example of that. Through faith and patience, he got the promise. That means he was given a promise, he wasn't given the reward. Instead, he was giving a promissory note or an oath, right? Now, Mike said something there interesting. My radar went off right away because I thought, I will use that. He didn't know it, but I was taking notes. He says, she's good with me. Not all promises are equal, are they? Mike will speak up. Absolutely not. Right? There's some people who say, I will pay you that. And it doesn't mean much. I had a lady I worked for late last week, and I have to go back to her place this week. And I said, Donna, you're not writing out 2 checks, so we'll just add it to next week's bill. She said, what if I die before then? I said, I'll give your husband a bill at the funeral. She said, okay, it's a deal then. But not all promises are equal. The reason I bring that up and go through that analogy, I'm putting in our terms, things we can relate to see what God is, what the Hebrew writer is saying. For when God made a promise to Abraham, since he had no greater by whom to swear, he swore by himself. Now, when you get something from the bank, even if it's an unsecured loan, meaning you have no collateral to put up, right? You still are putting something on the line, aren't you? You're putting your personal word. You are putting your personal credit on the line. Now think about this. Typically, what the bank wants, though, is something more valuable than what you are loaning, what you're getting. God had nothing more valuable to swear by. Nothing more valuable as a guarantor. So he swore by himself, 14, saying, surely I will bless you and multiply you. Man, cool idea, right? Abraham becomes a great nation. That's the multiply. I will bless you, right? Bless those that bless you, curse those that curse you. I will take care of you, right? That's all concepts within that idea. 15, and thus Abraham, having patiently waited, obtained the promise. From the time the promise was made, how long till he had Isaac? 25 years. Dad is 70 years old this year. Imagine being 75 and saying, God said, I'm going to bless you with another child. What you think, Dad? And then waiting 25 years for it. Now, do you see the connection? He's saying to the Hebrew writers, because they knew this, don't give up. Just because you haven't got it yet, don't give up. God made the promise. Now he's going to go back and he's going to talk about what it means for God to have made that promise. Questions or comments before I continue on? Emily.
Ray said somebody else would have to raise it, but if God promised that you were going to have a son, he would make it so you could raise it.
Yeah. Well, and that's what he did for Abraham. And
He would make Terry so she could help.
yep. So 16, for people swear by something greater than themselves. I already dealt with that, right? And in all their disputes, an oath is final for confirmation. Listen, I can't give this to you now, but I promise you, I may give you a cloak. I may give you something of value as a guarantor. Verse 17. So when God desired to show more convincingly to the heirs of the promise the unchangeable character of his purpose, he guaranteed it with an oath. So that by two unchangeable things in which it is impossible for God to lie, we have... I'm going to stop there, because this next part is deeper than it looks on its surface. The two unchangeable things. Number one, he's emphasizing God has nothing greater to promise by, so he promises by himself on two things. A, the promise, or we see the character of the promise itself, and by making an oath. Those are the two things that he gives as a guarantee. I'm going to give you this. I swear I'm going to give it to you. That's what God's saying. I mentioned Bob and Shirley. Bob was at court. To this day, we understand that there is a difference when you are under oath. It's called perjury. It is a criminal offense, right? That's what God has done. Not that his word was not good. He's saying this is for your sake. And that's what this whole passage is about. So you know the promise is coming. Furthermore, we mentioned not all promises are equal. This is someone through which cannot lie. Yeah, Mom's here, isn't she, Dad? She's teaching a class. Yeah, she's here. Stephanie, it's Stephanie that is hacked into Mom's account and was saying hello earlier. I was wondering why he took both of them to take care of Jason and Ella. So, yeah, Mom's downstairs. So, all right. That is the promise, and that's the point. Don't give up. Don't go back. Stay patient because God made the promise, and you can count on it. It's coming. All right. This is interesting. We who have fled for refuge might have strong encouragement to hold fast to the hope set before us. We who have fled for refuge. Now that's odd, isn't it? Odd terminology. This is what I think is so neat. And this is, we studied Revelation here a year or so ago. And when Revelation really came to life to me was when I realized that almost every verse in the book of Revelation is either a direct quote or an allusion to an Old Testament passage. You go into the Old Testament and you understand where it came from, and you can understand some context to what the writer's saying. The Hebrew students would have understood that because they were familiar with those. Here's one of those statements to us. It looks a little odd, but it had great meaning. This is the exact language in the Septuagint from Deuteronomy 4:42 and Joshua 20:9, referring to the cities of refuge. Now, we don't talk about cities of refuge that often, so you'll recall that throughout Judea, there were cities. I'm thinking 7. I may be off on that number. There were cities of refuge. And what they were for is the law said, an eye for an eye. So if you killed someone, you were going to be killed. But what about those cases where it's an accident? You go to swing your axe to cut a piece of wood, the axe handle flies off, hits your neighbor, and kills them dead. Uh-oh. Now, I think we would all agree it's not just for me to die. However, I say all, my neighbor's wife and his family aren't going to agree with me. They're going to be certain I deserve to die. I promise you. Right? I should have maintained my axe better, on and on and on. Here's what I would do. I would flee to a city of refuge where I would be protected from this man's family until an investigation was done, basically a trial, as to whether I was truly guilty of murder or not. So I was safe. What is the city of refuge that the Hebrew writer's talking about? Yeah. There were 6. Thank you. You're going to guess a number in the Bible, 3, 4, 7, or 12. So 6. Thank you for that. I appreciate that. 3 in the north and 3 in the south. So Ernie says the church, and yeah, that's what he's talking about. More specifically, Jesus Christ, right? Which the two are very closely related. He's saying, don't leave Jesus Christ. Don't leave. Here's the analogy. If you're in that city, in a city of refuge, you aren't going to step out. In fact, if you stepped outside the city, it was legal for his family to kill you. You aren't going to step out of that city, are you? Until things are settled. That's what he's saying. Stay in the city of refuge. Stay in Jesus Christ until you've obtained the promise. Stay patient. Stay faithful. Questions, comments? Again, that's Deuteronomy 4:42 and Joshua 20 and verse 9. And the word in the Lexington, Septuagint, is identical. Now, the next statement, to hold fast to the hope of one set before us. This is an interesting phrase, set before us. Scripture talks about the race set before us, about the joy set before Jesus Christ. The idea in Scripture being set before us is a reward, right? If you're running a race, you keep your eye on that goal, right? We've actually talked a lot about that in numerous lessons recently, about our focus, about staying focused on the goal. He's using that terminology. Now, the example that we are conjuring, though, is that idea of the hope set before us, but picture, if you will, on a boat being torn apart or thrown by the tempest, and you can see the port of refuge ahead of you, and you are striving to get there. That's the hope set before you, because he's getting ready to go deeper into a maritime example. Questions or comments? So verse 19, he takes this further. We have this as a sure and steadfast anchor of the soul, a hope that enters into the inner place behind the curtain. Bob read from King James, and it says the veil. What we are talking about is the veil in the temple. What happened when Jesus was crucified to that veil? Yes, that doesn't just happen by accident. Good point, Mike. Very good point. Now, that symbolizes something greater, because that Holy of Holies in the inside symbolized heaven, right? And what's being symbolized is heaven was just opened up by Jesus Christ. Now, Jesus is our anchor. Bear in mind, we've got that maritime example where the goal's before us, and our anchor is Jesus Christ, and we've thrown that anchor right dead center into the middle of the temple, into the Holy of Holies. Let's take it a step further. That anchor is thrown right into heaven itself, because Jesus didn't go to the Holy of Holies. The tearing of the veil was to represent that he was opening heaven. And Jesus is not in the Holy of Holies. He's in heaven. So here's our hope. We're anchored right into heaven itself by Jesus Christ. Here's the final argument or piece of encouragement that the Hebrew writer gives. Every other priest, remember we're dealing with high priests, would do their sacrificing and things, and eventually they would die, and that meant nothing for us. Jesus is our forerunner who paved the path right into heaven and sits there as an anchor for you and I to latch a hold of, keep our eyes on the hope, and follow it right in. Strong, strong visions that he is bringing about. Again, without understanding some of that Old Testament law, a lot of his argument is lost. He's making his argument to Jewish Christians. He's saying, don't go back to this city that's about to fall. Don't go back to the old law is really what he's getting at. Hold on to Jesus Christ. He's about to make the decision, or make the argument that going back to the old law is to let go of that anchor. He's setting that argument up. You can't go back without letting go of the anchor. Right? Questions or comments? So now here's the problem. We've set this up as Jesus being this, not just high priest, great high priest, remember? But he is not even a Levite, let alone of the heritage or lineage of Aaron. So how can he be a high priest at all? And Bob, you've asked a couple questions about Melchizedek. We are finally ready, although it was introduced, the idea was introduced quite some time ago. Now we're coming back to Melchizedek. But here's why that parenthetical statement was so important. He's saying, listen, wake up and be imitators of those who were patient and faithful and thereby obtained the promise. Because you've got a hope right in heaven itself that will pull you right in there along with it. And that individual is superior to every high priest. And I'm going to prove that by going back to Melchizedek. 18, thank you. So, I'm glad you brought that up. Perfect timing. Let's get it right. You're getting a little bit like me, Bob. Genesis 14, verse 18. Yep. So, let me introduce this idea. This, to me, is amazing about the Bible. Yes, because Genesis 14 is Abraham saving Lot. He comes back from the slaughter of the 5 kings. So we'll deal with that in just a moment. Here's what is amazing to me about the Bible, and we won't get very far into Melchizedek, but this is something I think is even more useful before we get into the details. So the Bible doesn't give many details on a lot of things, right? In fact, it's not really a detail-oriented book. I mean, if you want an example about that, it drives me crazy. I want to know what Jesus wrote in the sand. Why would John not tell me that? That irritates me, right? And there's a lot of other details like that I want to know. But they're not important. In fact, John himself deals with these things I wrote that you might believe, right? You might be saved, essentially. So here's something to think about. And Louise, I told you about the Bible Project. This is a concept that they draw out really well. The Bible doesn't give a lot of details about a lot of things, but the details it does give are super important. Sometimes we underestimate how important the details it does give. Think about that. We go through and we skip. John and I were in Mark 7 today, and Mark doesn't mention all these people Matthew deals with him healing. And Matthew just says he healed a bunch of people. Mark tells us about one, tells us exactly how he healed them. Now, there's details in both accounts that we aren't given, but the details that are given are of immense value. So picture this. You're Moses, and you're writing through the story. And you deal with Abraham and Isaac. You deal with Abraham and Lot. And Abraham and Lot have to part because their flocks are at odds. And Lot looks down and says, I'm taking the good stuff. And he goes down towards the cities. But he's not there very long at all till he gets in trouble and he's actually kidnapped. And word gets to Abraham that he's kidnapped. And they are kings that have Lot, but Abraham's a powerful man. And Abraham goes to his own men and he says, I'm going down taking on these kings. I'm going to whoop them all and bring Lot back. And he does exactly that. And so when he does that, he beats all these kings that are beating up on everyone else. So he's got chestfuls of loot, like the pirate ships coming back. In chapter 14, now think about this. You're Moses writing about all this stuff. All important stuff. All people that we're going to deal with for generations, right? And in chapter 14, here's Abraham coming back with his pirate loot, right? And he bumps into someone. Someone we never heard of before. But he's described very curiously. A priest of the Most High God. What? Where's that come from? Moses, what? How about getting back on target, right? Getting focused here. What does this guy Melchizedek have? And so Abraham stops, and this man Melchizedek blesses Abraham. What? No, wait. This is the father of God's people. And Melchizedek is blessing him. Moses, I'm not sure what's happening here. And then Abraham goes back in those big pirate chests. He gets 10% of everything he got, and he gives it to Melchizedek. Now, Bob, Melchizedek didn't have an AK-47 pointing at him, right? Abraham's not being held hostage. He does this willingly. He pays a tithe before there is such a thing as a tithe. And then, okay, here's kicker. Okay, you told me about this Melchizedek. He seems like a really important guy, right? So what else are you going to tell me about him? Nothing. And we just move on. And I got to be honest with you, speaking as a man, as Paul says, that's just crazy. What kind of nonsense is this? Now he's mentioned again Psalm, but it's so peculiar. I think David wrote about him because he's like, there's this strange guy back there. It seemed important, you know? And so I'll reference him in a song. And nothing for thousands of years. And it turns out he's an incredibly important character. You see, he's not in Genesis 14 by accident. Moses didn't know that. He just knew he had to write about Melchizedek. In fact, the fact that he pops out of nowhere and disappears into nowhere is of the utmost importance. So next week, Lord willing, we'll learn about Melchizedek. Corey.
They still won't rely on the New Testament, but even back then when the Old Testament was everything, what did they think about Melchizedek? I mean, I can't believe they just brushed him off because he's in there. Do you have any idea what they believe?
I have my suspicion. It goes kind of like this. Huh?
I mean, because they're not given enough to have a belief, but
He makes no sense until Jesus Christ comes along. And the scripture says, here's why he's here and here's what he meant.
How old was he?
Yeah?
How long did you live?
Yeah. Exactly.
Good questions.
Because you're talking about way back here and then way up there.
Yeah.
Good question.
And that's the very issue. And that's the point that the Hebrew writer is going to bring out in chapter 7.
We have to get to this.
The rest of the story. Jerry.
Can you tell me why Melchizedek in Hebrews is spelled differently than in Genesis?
I hadn't even caught that, so I will look at that and see what I can come up with.
Because the first, like it's spelled in Hebrews, the first time that name shows up is in Hebrews. But if it's spelled the other way, it shows up back in Genesis where Bob said.
I will look into that, so I did not even notice, was unaware of that. So I'm glad you pointed that out. I'm
Would that
curious.
be just the different languages?
It could be, I have no idea though. So, yeah, it would be in Hebrew, in the Old Testament, in Greek, but names, I don't know. So I want to look at that. So thank you for your time. And Lord willing, we'll pick up there next week.